Hello, everyone. It is great to be here, and joining me today is Dr. Tiffany Mcdowell, and she is director of the Equity Institute in Evanston, Illinois. And it is just such a delight and pleasure. She is a known entity in the community there, just years of work in this space. And it is absolutely a pleasure to meet you. And I'm so excited to be able to have this conversation. So is there anything that I forgot about your background that you want to jump in there and tell us about?
Sure. Well, I appreciate being here with you all. I know YWCA Cleveland, Greater Cleveland has been doing a lot of work, and we love the 21-day challenge. We just started and launched that as well in our Evanston North Shore community. So I got great response. I'll just add, I come to this from a community psychology perspective. So when I think about the work that we do to address our mission of eliminating racism and empowering women, it's always about healing and wellness and well-being, right? So I think the conversation today really helps us think broadly about what that looks like on a community level.
Honestly, I am not super familiar with community psychologists. I know Resma, who does a lot of work around racialized trauma. I sort of think of him as a community psychologist. And, we are doing a deep dive into racialized trauma. It sounds like you're familiar with that work as well.
Yeah.
And that is some powerful, powerful work. Is that embedded? Is that coming to the work you're doing? Are you doing that now, or?
So that is a piece of the work. I'll say the way we come, and I love Resma Menkumi. I really, really love his work and his model. I think he's definitely on the forefront of thinking about the ways that trauma has embedded itself in your body, and he calls it somaticized, right? Because we do see that trauma is transmitted, and you can transfer it generationally, intergenerationally, right? So he definitely has informed the way that we think about it. But I also would say that there are some kind of things that happen within communities. So not just the individuals within the community, but the ways that when you go in certain communities and you see just disorganization, right? Where it's going back to kind of like the sociology of it, but we don't understand that the people who live in communities where you can see disinvestment, we think of it as an individual level change that needs to happen. But community psychologists think about bringing that back up into the structural changes. So working on policies and systems to support people to be able to make healthier choices in their community, being able to have access to the workforce, access to food, access to transportation, to healthy places to live, work, and play, that impacts our own physical, mental well-being. But we always tend to think about it as an individual choice rather than someone else, our systems having to provide that for us, or having that be a basic right of citizens in our communities. So it is our goal that we try to work together with communities as well as with policymakers to make that happen.
Yeah, amen, amen. I'm just gonna hold up Resma's book, My Grandmother's Hands, which he talks about racialized trauma, really, and he uses the framework in which he's talking about Black bodies, but also talks about blue bodies or uniform bodies, as well as white bodies. And I think it is just amazingly insightful work, and again, so important, as you said, around those structural pieces. But we're here to talk about reparations, and we really are going to get there. We are going to get there. Just so much happening, yesterday, today, if you are watching this at another time, today is June 18th, tomorrow is June 19th, and the Senate and the House have just passed, Juneteenth as a federal holiday. I was a little surprised that it passed the House unanimously. I mean, the Senate
The Senate.
unanimously.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't pass the House unanimously, but there were, it was overwhelming in the House, and certainly unanimous in the Senate. That was a little surprising for me, and yet I'm trying not to read too much into it.
Right, right. Yeah. Yeah, and I think about we were kind of chatting a little bit before, but it definitely is a symbolic moment. I appreciate that last year, maybe 2020 was the first time that many folks in our country had even heard of Juneteenth. So the fact that we're here now, I think is important, right? So I don't want to dismiss that or discount that, because there have been organizers across the country who have been pushing for this for generations, right? And so I think that's something to be lifted up and to be shown as a model for organizing. I think also, thinking about what comes next. So to your point about it passed unanimously in the Senate, we don't know why. So I think figuring out the best way and the best approach to partner with our legislators to say, hey, building on this, what does this mean for your constituencies and the way that the spirit of Juneteenth and celebrating and recognizing, the fact that people who were once enslaved did not find out until 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation came out, and that slave owners or people who held slaves were reticent, obviously, to let them go. So, and then after that, were repaid for their losses, the loss of that property that they had owned, right? So
Right.
thinking about now, all these hundreds of years later, how do we start to build on that knowledge? So the knowledge of what Juneteenth means, the knowledge of what slavery is, and then getting to your point. And I know the hot topic today is reparations. So what does that mean for what we as people of color, Black folks, people who have been, who are descendants of those folks who were once enslaved, what does that mean? And is that enough?
Yeah, so reparations, sometimes I say the R word because people feel really passionate about it on one side or the other side. But it's fascinating when you go back. So we are at 1865, just talking about Juneteenth and Galveston and all of these pieces. And in that same year, um, you know, uh, General, I'm drawing a blank on his name, says, yeah, we owe 40 acres and a mule. Uh, I don't know if it's General Johnson. I don't know why I'm drawing a blank on his name, but he says, we owe something here. We owe something here. And they land on 40 acres and a mule. The land is really along the Atlantic coast.
Mm-hmm.
Is the land that was given. It does, the promise from the general goes to Abraham Lincoln and then to the Congress.
Mm-hmm.
It passes in the House and the Senate, 40 acres and a mule, and Lincoln signs it into law. This is the reparation.
Yes.
And then Lincoln is assassinated.
Mm-hmm.
And the new president, Johnson,
Johnson.
Andrew Johnson
Mm-hmm.
says, hold on here, let me roll this back.
Right.
And rescinds it all.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Economists have done a lot of work. A lot of Duke economists have looked at 40 acres and a mule today and what would be a common reparation. Reparations, as you know, sort of fall into two camps. There's a settlement and there's an atonement. So an atonement reparation really happens over a long period of time. It's an investment in a number of items, programs, initiatives, and settlement is just what we think it is. It is, a one-time settlement. And John Conyers introduces in 1989 the first bill on reparations since 1865. And after it's repealed by Johnson, the Congress actually comes back again and tries to get another bill passed, and he will not sign it. And so Conyers really comes with the modern day approach in 1989.
Right.
Submits it a number of times, I think maybe 15 times in total. And then Representative Jackson Lee picks it up after he leaves Congress, and then eventually passes away. Representative Conyers passes away, and Representative Lee Jackson sort of carries the banner. So just a little bit of history. HR 40. What do you think about HR 40? What is the fear, the pushback, the resistance, the denial? And how did Evanston, a municipality, say, forget what you're doing, federal government, we're going to get ourselves together?
Yeah. So there's a lot there, right? So I think I'll start with, I love that you talked about the definition of reparations and kind of what that looks like. I want to dig in a little deeper, because if you think about reparative justice, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of us are familiar with restorative justice. That's been a huge organizing tool, or a reframe of our justice system, right? To think about, just think about the words repair and restore. If you've been harmed, what is it going to take for you to feel like you have been fully restored or fully repaired of that harm? And when you think about the harms of slavery, that is a huge rift, especially as you think over time, the lost lives, the lost impact of Black families in this community, in this country, but then also just structurally, the disinvestment in Black communities. We commemorated the Tulsa massacre, for instance. So there's so many different things and evidence of these ways that not only did slavery and the impacts of slavery harm Black people, Black families, historically over time, but then also we had the Jim Crow era. We had these other things that happened. So there are groups, I think when you talk about HR 40, that's one particular tool that at the federal level is meant to repair the harms of slavery that this country, because the benefits that this country had because of the ownership of Black bodies. But then governments in municipal areas, cities, communities, many different organizations, schools are even starting to wake up and realize that they also benefited from that. And they also must take some ownership in the harm that was done. I like to even lift up the example of Georgetown, because my family was a part of the families that were owned as slaves by the Jesuits, who were the founders and the leadership of Georgetown University. So they were sold. Yeah, they were sold to pay off debts that they owed at that time. So they now are paying reparations to the descendants in a variety of ways. They just have earmarked an endowment to support financial restitution for the descendants. So reparations can look like a lot of different things. So I don't want to discount that. I think it is up to the people who were harmed to be able to tell others what they need from that. What, if you harm me, if you steal something from me, the court's going to say, okay, you need to make her whole by giving that same thing back in financial form, and you're probably going to go to jail, right? That's restitution in our country, based on our legal system. So people are pretty strong when they think about reparations because of the impact over time. So I also will say then that HR 40, at this point where we are in 2021, having that is another symbolic move, right? Because it's a proposal to study what it would
Mhm.
take to
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
have
yeah.
reparations, right? It's not passing a
That's right.
law that's going to sign a check and then
That's
tomorrow
right.
I'm going to have a check in my account.
Right.
It's not a stimulus. It's not
Right.
financial restitution. It's
Yeah.
really just to study what it would take to be to make descendants of slaves whole
Mhm.
again. And so I think that's another challenge, right? Because you mentioned that the 40 acres and the mule, we're so far beyond that. We're so many generations past those original folks
Mhm.
who should have gotten the reparations
Mhm.
then, that
Mhm.
now I think reparations needs to advance into more of a structural conversation.
Mhm.
Also, I don't want to move away from this point that we make about other organizations and them paying into or thinking about the harms that they benefited from or they themselves may have perpetrated against Black folks or anybody.
Mhm.
And I think reparations, we tend to think about it as reparations for slavery, but reparations have been paid in this country for too many different groups, right? We
That's
know
right.
that Jews after the Holocaust were
Yeah.
paid some monies in reparation,
Yep.
those survivors of the Holocaust, as well as people were paid after
World War
Hurricane
II.
Katrina.
Oh,
Yes, the
Katrina.
Japanese in World War
Yeah.
II, yes,
Yeah.
that were interred in the camps,
Yeah.
Hurricane Katrina survivors. So there's many times where our federal government has paid financial restitution to
Yeah.
people who have been harmed. So it's not unheard of. So I think starting there by saying like this is not a new thing. This is not something that hasn't been done, and it can be done. I think it's just in the ways that we think about implementation is going to be
Yeah.
really important.
So let's move to Evanston a little bit. I
Mhm.
have seen the blueprint, um, and I think that the printing or the blueprint I saw was from 2019. I don't know if there was an earlier blueprint, but just take us back a little bit to when the conversations started, because they are not linked to sort of the current, uh, what people are recognizing as this current reckoning around racial inequities in 2020. It's earlier, it's much earlier
Mhm.
than that. And so
Right.
talk a little bit about who drove that, what was sort of the impetus, and this incredible blueprint, and then just managing sort of the pushback now. Uh,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, there's a lot. And I think it definitely happened. It kind of was happening under the national radar. So people didn't know that this was taking place until last year when the world started looking at racial justice in many forms. But this really started with it was the brainchild of a local alderperson, Robin Rue Simmons, who has recently, she didn't run for reelection. She stepped down from that position, but she definitely was one of the key organizers and architects for what that looked like.
a woman,
And
a woman.
yes,
Oh yeah,
yes, awesome, awesome. She's phenomenal, and I really appreciate her stepping into this and really being thoughtful about it. And I'll say reparations in Evanston is a very specific thing. They were not looking at reparations for slavery, right? They were looking at because Evanston is a suburb of Illinois, pretty highly educated, income levels are higher than the regional average. We sit in the shadow of Northwestern University, one of the elite institutions of this country. And we also saw that there had been historically policy decisions that were made that excluded socially and structurally excluded Black residents.
Mhm.
So, and for instance, for housing, they had evidence, there is evidence of redlining that was done. Black residents were forced to relocate relocate their homes, where there were instances where 4 houses, Black residents actually had to pick up and move their houses. They paid to have their houses moved to a specific community in Evanston. So think about that, right? Like you were being made to move your home because they wanted to take that land and repurpose it
Right,
and create a commercial district.
right.
So and none of the white residents were required to do this, right?
Mhm.
So when you think about that, wasn't slavery, that wasn't hundreds of years ago.
Right,
This was 70 years ago, 80 years ago, right?
right.
So these people still live in Evanston. So the impacts of that are more tangible and more it's more real and more current. Also with education, there is a great number of data and reports that have been done on education equity, because we see that Black students do not fare as well as white students. They're more likely to be disciplined more harshly. We see that in other educational systems or public school systems, but we definitely see it in Evanston. And so regardless of the amount of resources that are
Mhm.
put toward educational justice, we still don't see that type of the outcomes taking shape structurally.
Right.
So Alderwoman Simmons took the time to gather the data and then started to work with the National African American Reparations Council to think about a study. And then after looking at the data, then they made recommendations, which then went to the community to review and to consider.
Mm. Wow. Love that. Love that. So what's happening now? Because it's kind of
Mm.
getting um, some energy behind it.
It's blown up. Yeah,
Mhm.
definitely blown up. I missed the part about another thing that kind of pushed this into the spotlight was the legalization and decriminalization of cannabis.
Mhm.
So that allowed for
The
a pot
revenue
of
source.
money, the
Yeah,
revenue.
it's the
Yes,
revenue
yes,
source.
exactly.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
all
yeah,
of these
yeah.
things
That,
require
that Black people
funding.
went to jail for.
Yes, yes, exactly. So again, it made it like this great opportunity because it said, hey, yes, Black people have been over incarcerated for cannabis sales,
Mhm.
illegal cannabis sales,
Yeah.
prior to 2019. But now we're getting revenues from
Mhm.
legalized cannabis sales in
Mhm.
forms of the tax.
Right.
What can we do with that tax? And so they were able to pass the ordinance in Evanston where the revenues from those sales would go into this reparations fund. Um,
Mhm.
I also should say there are a number of residents, local residents, who organized and created a residence fund. So the residents are paying into a fund to
Wow.
go to cash payments for directly for Black residents in Evanston. So it definitely generated not just kind of conversation back and forth, but it did spur people to action. And so to your point about where we are now, I think because the decision was made to start with housing and having housing be the thing that was
Mhm.
the first initiative that folks would receive some reparations for.
Yeah.
So I believe it's $25,000 basically voucher to Black residents to support, either purchase of a home or refinancing, or it can go to your housing basically. And so we know that's a pretty narrow scope, right? That's not going to
Mhm.
impact every single Black resident that's eligible for reparations in
Yep.
Evanston. So I think that also challenges a lot of people who say, okay, what about me? That
Right.
doesn't impact me. I'm not looking to purchase a home. Also, there are detractors because when you think about how hard it is to purchase homes, and you can't just go in and pay money and get any home you want, right? Redlining still exists in
Yeah.
Evanston, across our country. And so we know that there are several other systems at play that have inherent bias and inequities. And so I think I love that the committee took a step, right? Because that's really what it's about. But it's the first step. And I think as much as we can, we need to look at the pros and cons and keep moving forward, keep thinking about what does come next. So now that that's in place, how can we impact our banks, our financial lenders? Because there are unfair lending practices, not just in Evanston, but everywhere across this country.
Yeah.
And so having our financial lenders be a part of the conversation to understand what they can do to support unfair lending practices in communities like Evanston. And also thinking about the ways that residents can continue to have their voices heard so that we can have more buy-in and more support.
I am curious about the residents who are putting into a fund. Are they doing that through property taxes, or how is that happening?
No, they're just generating donations.
Oh,
Several
wow.
organizations, nonprofits have just started to pool a fund. There are a number of, what I'll say about Evanston is because it is, there are a number of people who are on all sides, right? And it is a small, tight-knit community. So it's not just talking about reparations, you're talking about your neighbor, right? It's a community of 77,000. So not that many folks, right? So when you think about this, it really does bring it down to a very local neighbor to neighbor level. And people see the impact that this can have, and they want to be a part of it.
Wow. Wow. I have to say that there is, you said people on all sides. Certainly we have seen brewing this year, or maybe over several years. I'm just sort of dialing into it this year, and have been reading all about critical race theory and or CRT. And people feel really passionate either for it or against it. And I have looked at the definition of critical race theory, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but I understand that it is an approach to look at racism as a systematic tool that has negatively impacted people along racial lines. And that is how I understand critical race theory, that it was used initially decades ago by the legal system and as an approach, and has grown since then. And I am baffled at what part of critical race theory are you against? I just, to me, if you're against it, is it somehow tying in some more convoluted way that you don't believe America is structurally racist? So that in order to believe that, you would have to look at any data and say, well, it's the responsibility of those people. There's something wrong with the people. That's what it feels like to me.
Right.
But ultimately, they're saying something wrong with you.
Right. Right.
Not something wrong with the structure.
Right. Right, exactly. Well, and to be honest, that actually is what critical race theory is. That's the basis of it. It's requiring the consideration of race as law is applied throughout our country. So it's not what's the word? for folks to be able to say that, oh, race does not make a difference, they would have had to apply critical race theory to come to that conclusion. So, so that really is what critical race theory is. It's using a critical lens, using the lens of race to look at the ways that laws and policies have been inequitably enacted or implemented across a variety of sectors and implications. So again, until you have done, if you're not using a critical lens on race, you can't come to that conclusion. So the fact that people are saying that now lets us know that they really don't understand what critical race theory really is. One, and I think two, I don't understand what is the harm in talking about the way that our structures have been designed to be colorblind, right? Because we know that it's through that color blindness that really the harm was done. So yes, we have this history of the violence and brutality of slavery. We know what happened to our sisters and brothers that were native to this country as colonizers came in and overtook this country, and they were pushed to certain areas. Decisions were made about the ways that this country would develop and take shape. And many of them were to place people of color in, subservient positions. That was institutionalized in our laws, right? We have Jim Crow laws that are still on the books. So we know that to be in existence. So you can't argue that. You cannot argue that. I think one of the things that people are trying to do is use the term critical race theory to quiet or to remove those laws from our history books, to make us forget that this exists. So it's almost like we're going to say we're going to start from today and then forget about what came before today, when all of us existed before today, right? So we can't forget that. And I think that's what's important to remember here. So I've been encouraging folks to not just get caught up in the critical race conversation, critical race theory conversation, but keep pushing forward on structural and systemic change that explicitly addresses the ways that Black folks and people of color, other marginalized groups are able to live, work, and play, and be healthy and safe in their communities every day. That's really what our end goal has to be.
But I think, the conversation around critical race theory, CRT, reparations, Juneteenth, narrative matters, and who controls the price of cross timbers royalty. My watch started talking to me, so narrative really matters in this country, and has. So we can go back hundreds of years, and the way the narrative gets controlled is so very important to what we are told about each other, what we believe about each other. And to me, this is a war for the narrative.
Yes, that's a great point. And I think that's really, especially in this age, we get so much of our information through, our Facebook feed and social media or under 140 characters, that we don't really get to dive in and really get to understand what these issues are all about. So I appreciate you sharing and talking about narrative. I love, I don't know, I know you all are familiar with the Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation Initiative, that the architect of that was Dr. Gail Christopher, who is an amazing woman and is being funded by the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. Narrative is a part of that. So when you think about healing and think about reparations, restitution, the way that we talk about our stories, right? And so bringing in Black folks, descendants of folks who were enslaved, people who are either current or descendants of folks who were redlined or, had their communities dismantled by disinvestment. Hearing our voices and our stories I think that's just as important and more important than listening to kind of the rhetoric from all these other sides about what we should not be doing, right? So as much as we can, gather in fellowship, listening to this conversation between the two of us, I think is a great start. So it's really coming together and being immersing yourself in the narratives and the histories of people who are living this, right? So it's not just thinking about what you're seeing people on the news or
Right.
the media share and what their narrative about race and racism is. I think just getting connected with people who are living it every day.
Mhm. Yeah, we brought Gail Christopher here at Cleveland. We did a 2-day summit that Isabel Wilkerson kicked us off with in 2019, November 2019. We did a commemoration of 1619, 400 years of inequities.
Mhm.
And, Gail was, engaged in pieces and parts in the planning, and she's just so absolutely amazing. And it made me think of resiliency, and I'm interested in hearing your practices of resiliency. When you are someone who is living the work of racial equity and racial inequity every single day. You are steeped in it up to your eyeballs every single day, and it does take a toll on you.
Yes.
And so I'm just curious what your, we call it soul care here at the YWCA Greater Cleveland, what that has looked like for you. And then during, a pandemic, what does it look like and how do you encourage others?
Yes, thank you for lifting that up. I think that's a key part of this work is really to start with your own self-care, and then going back to Resma Menken, that the way that trauma, just is so built, the trauma response is built into our bodies. And I do believe, and he talks about my grandmother's hands, he talks about what you learn. And so if you think about for people who are descendants of slaves and descendants of all that trauma that's been passed down, but we also are resilient people because we're still here, right? We are still here. And so I just really lean into that. I'd like to surround myself. I'm with family now. So I enjoy that. I like to stay connected to my family, but I also like to stay connected to my community and, having friends and family support, especially during COVID-19, has been definitely difficult to manage, but it's so important to stay connected to folks. I also love this idea of rest as resistance. So there is a woman who created this wonderful movement called the Nap Ministry. Trisha Hershey, if you're not familiar with that, I love that because she centers this idea that you don't have to do work all the time. This culture that we're in, especially for Black folks who are descendants of people who were enslaved, they did not get a chance to rest. They didn't have a choice or a say in when they got to rest or work. So to
Mhm.
be able to be here today, to be able to think about when I get to stop and rest, that is resistance, that is an act of joy and resilience for me. And so I make that time purposeful. I take breaks, I take vacation. I'm purposeful about that. And I try to make sure that other people do that as well. But I think also just connecting to the fact that this is not just my work. I personally have a team. We sit in a community of folks. We sit in a network of YWCAs across the country, and such a great opportunity to work with our sister associations to join together to think about what eliminating racism, empowering women means in all of our different municipal spaces. But we don't have to do this by ourselves. And so I think just for me, just tuning into my network, whether it's personal, whether it's professional, whether it's like my structural network, I take that so seriously. And I always think about building network and building community as a part of the work. So I don't want to just keep working. I really want to make sure that there are a variety of people, like whatever is the case, that people can get access to a network of care.
I love that, the NAP ministry. I am going to dig into that. I have
Yes.
come to NAP more in the last 2 years and give myself permission to do that. I do think there's something really valuable when you say, you know, my ancestors did not have the option to choose when they worked or when they didn't work. And there's this subtlety sort of always in my brain around I cannot rest. I cannot rest. I am not allowed to rest. And so I need a very deep level of intentionality to engage in self-care. And I
Yes.
do see that for other women and particularly for other Black women. And
Mhm.
so the NAP ministry, I'm just, thank you. Thank you.
Yes.
That is
Yes.
awesome. That is awesome.
Yeah. Yeah. And I also want to just tie that back to a little bit about what you were saying about the individual, like, oh, well, Black folks aren't achieving. There's some individual kind of thing wrong with that person or this person.
Mhm.
But what I love about the NAP ministry is that it reminds us that we are not lazy. We're not, it's not that we can't produce, because we're definitely we're meeting and achieving and exceeding a lot of the things set out for us. So we ourselves have set this unrealistic kind of work life balance that doesn't make sense. So I really appreciate this idea that we can take back and kind of reframe the ways that we as Black folks think about what it means to be lazy or
Mhm.
unacceptable, or our work practices, right? So I love that. So I really appreciate, and I see the team has dropped the link because I feel like that's such a great tool in just reminding us, like, you don't have to overwork yourself. That's a part of how racism somaticizes, as Resma would say, like it takes shape in your body and then it comes out as physical illness, mental illness,
That's right.
and anxiety and depression.
That's right. That's right. I am interested in the work of the Institute
Yeah.
that you have, that you lead, and would love to hear more about that.
Sure. So, as you all know, because our mission is to eliminate racism and empowering women, in Evanston, we've been doing the racial justice work for a little over a decade. And at that time, there were a number of community organizations that came together and actually did a racial justice assessment. And from that assessment, from community leaders, they found that there needed to be a specific place and organizing structure that people in community in Evanston and the North Shore could come to, or to be seen as a place where people could gather to learn, and then to organize to move forward. And so our leadership at the time decided, okay, how do we ramp this up? How do we not just think about this as a program, but really think about ourselves as a hub? And so we developed the Institute. And the Equity Institute really has been a space where we think about racial justice, racial, gender justice, and equity across multiple levels of the system. So we work at the systems level to make sure our policies are inclusive rather than exclusive to groups. We work with communities so that we're creating inclusive and welcoming societies. We work at organizations so that we're helping organizations to shift their policies. And then, of course, we want to work with people. So making sure that people are building power within themselves to move from awareness to action. And so by doing all of those things in concert, we really hope that we can start to dig into some of the structural change that we've been talking about today. Because it's not enough to just do, the individual education, which it's great. It's good to kind of help people get their feet wet, get their foot in the door, but there needs to be something else. And so when we talked earlier about the your question about why did residents or why did neighbors want to pitch into a reparations fund? That's really what that looks like, right? It's moving people beyond just, oh, now I know the term, I know the definition of structural racism. Let me go do my other work. Now it's, oh, wait a minute. Now I understand this and I can see the impacts of it. I can see how that's playing out with my neighbors, or I can see why when I see homelessness and housing instability in my community, I can see why that happens to people of color more often than white folks. And this is what I want to do about that, right? Like those are the things that we want people to start working toward.
I love that. That's really powerful work. And it is counter to what I have experienced, which has been, now I know, I feel overwhelmed. And I'm so overwhelmed, I'm frozen and can't do anything. And what I hear you saying is the table got set, the buffet is there, and people are taking and sharing and driving and figuring out how to replenish the buffet table. Yes. And I've seen a little bit of that, but more of my experience has been, I'm terrified. I don't know what to do. I'm overwhelmed. How do we solve this? This is too big. And I'm sort of like, wow, there's sort of a action-oriented engine that seems ignited. And I'm wondering what you link that driver to.
That's a great question. You know, I was trained as a couple and family therapist. So I just always bring it back to that. And it's funny you say an engine. You know, I think about a family or a system as an engine. So without one of those parts, the engine is not going to work. But until you know, figure out what works, what's the best thing, you know, what makes the most sense. So you kind of have to play around with it. It takes some work, but if you want that car to go somewhere, you got to do that work. And so I use that analogy. I used to use it with the families that I was supporting back in my clinical days. I use that same analogy now when I think about systems more broadly. And you just always have to be thinking about the work. So even if I'm not I'm not a mechanic, but I know enough, I have resources to find someone to help me do that, right? So I also know enough to know when I can be the person and when I can step aside and bring in some other expertise or some other experience. And so I think it's building your network. I think it's having everybody align that this engine is going to be a car engine and not a plane engine, right? Because we don't want to be going in different directions. We all have to be working toward the same thing. And then also figuring out where is it that we want to go once we get it built. And so I think that's also to your earlier point about feeling scared. To me, a lot of this work that we do is helping people just get organized around what is it that we want to be achieving together. And then let's try to take brave steps together, right? So it's not just me doing it by myself. And yes, I'm nervous about that. No, it's that we all are connected. We all have a network and you have some support here. You have some support to try things out. And if it doesn't get us very far, then we kind of take a step back, we rest, reflect, and then try again the next time when we're ready. And that's really my kind of viewpoint. And that's what I've learned. I think that's what I've learned in my career and just what I've heard from mentors and other folks watching people. Even you're telling the history of HR 40 and just the consistency of, you know, Representative Conyers and then Representative Jackson Lee taking that up. There's always going to be more work. So I think about just connecting with people so that your legacy is that they want to take up your work, that it doesn't just move on or die when you go away, but that someone is always there to keep that moving.
I'm hearing a lot of courage in what you are talking about sort of as a foundation. And I think part of what drives courage or enables courage is really compassion. You know, I during the the COVID time, I've had an opportunity to do some compassion training, and that's really where I got introduced to RESMA. And it's an incredible practice for me that elicits courage. Because you have this deep compassion, not only for yourself, but for others, not in a colorblind way, but in a heart to heart way. That is really powerful. And I think that all of that has to happen in order for neighbors to be able to see each other and, you know, sort of do the next thing. It's so amazing. So there's a question. I have to just say, you are just so smart and brilliant and beautiful. And I'm so encouraged about the work that you are doing, and
Thank you.
really want you to do more work in the network. Um,
Thank you.
and I'm going to be a very loud voice around having that happen. So you know I have a big voice in the network. So um,
Well, I love the work, and it's definitely,
yeah,
I've learned a lot from you all as well. And I've just been with YWCA Evanston North Shore 3 years, so to be able to unfortunately this past year, because we were all online, I have been able to be more connected across our network of associations, and that has been a blessing in disguise, right? So I think that's another possibility to open the doors to more of this type of opportunity.
yeah, and not to go on a tangent and talk about YWCA business, but we have to be more strategic around our sharing. And I think that we haven't always been.
Mm-hmm.
And so you kind of hear what somebody else is doing and pick it up. And I think there's a better approach, more strategic, smarter approach that's going to make us healthier, bolder, bigger, stronger, wiser, and all those things. But there is a question.
Yes.
That somebody has asked about, actually, it's a dear friend of mine, Robin, has asked the question about just critical thinking in general as it relates to, um, I believe, understanding race and racism, the whole lens, just
Yes.
taking a critical, approach. And she points out that the word race causes um, so much, it triggers in us this sort of
Mhm.
subliminal emotional reaction that
Yes.
is that is shame in some for some people groups. So I'm just wondering, I think we are in a space where I've seen more engagement around critical thinking. And yes, it's today it's the willing talking to the willing. And so it's a conversation in which we are supporting and uplifting each other. But I think that there is some wonderful critical thinking happening, or how do we continue among groups that aren't always coming to the same platform to have more critical conversation.
Yeah, that's a great question. And to be honest, like I definitely would challenge where that sits in our educational system. So if you are a person that has children or you have an impact in your educational systems, definitely really advocate for the placement of not critical race theory necessarily, but critical thinking skill development, right? If you can impact a young person or even an older person to think critically, that is definitely something that's been lost in several generations, right? We're not learning how to take an idea and just break it down critically. So I'll start there. But then when you embed critical race theory, or I'm sorry, like thinking about race critically, and race, and then how it plays out in multiple steps, that's really the first thing that we do with folks, is to take them through their own identity. And so thinking about where you may be the oppressor or the oppressed based on your identity, and it depends on the context. So once you have to like make your mind do those kind of gymnastics to think, oh, in this space, I'm more privileged than in this space, right? And that goes for any of us. Many of us hold identities that in context or in certain parts of our society, we're viewed as better than someone else, right? And so being able to think about that and think about the world as not all one thing, black or white, you know, either or, but in those shades of gray, I think helps us start to build our muscle toward having those types of conversations. And so being a part of these kind of conversations, at Evanston, we do what we call Let's Talk at Lunch, where we gather monthly. We were doing it in person prior to COVID-19. Now they're online. But just gathering around a meal or a snack and having a conversation about a recent happening in the media or in the world and talking about what that means through the lens of race and racism. And so you're building your muscle to talk about, and even saying the word racism is not easy for people. So just building the habit of doing that, that makes you go out and then you'll say it at work. You'll say it among your friends or colleagues. You're more likely to use race and racism and talk about it and weave it in to spaces where otherwise you may not be ready to or may not feel comfortable. That really is one of the first signs that you're ready to do some work on it, if you can actually talk about it, especially given you know, this erasure that we started this conversation on. So and talking about changing the narrative. So I think that's really important. And I love that Robin is talking about the way that shame is embedded in our bodies. And so Resma really talks about that for white people too. White folks have this shame and guilt embedded. So you will see white people want to stop conversations about race because their own guilt will come up, even if they are not the person who enslaved my ancestor. They may not know anything about that, but that shame and guilt will pop up and that will stop the conversation. So it's just as important for white folks to get in the habit and get ready and used to talking about race as it is for Black folks and other folks of color.
And that is the racialized trauma that many white bodies experience. And I think that one of the things I love about Resma is just pulling that forward and discussing that. And it is not often talked about, that response and that feeling of the white body. And I think that it is incredibly important because the racialized trauma is not isolated to one people group. Or, you know, it's something that we have collectively experienced as a nation, and the complexity of who was here and whose land it was, all of that, we're all tied into this complex racialized trauma experience that we've not really begun to unravel. And I think the critical thinking is so important at a system level, but also the way we do our work individually. I know that, you know, we've done a lot of work internally over the last 6 years inside the YWCA, and it really does boil down to being able to shake up our thinking, and examine things that we've done a certain way forever and ever, and begin to recognize, okay, that was, why were we doing that? That was harming people. That was harming people we like. And it's so shocking, and it really takes being able to sort of step back and with a critical lens, look at simple things in a critical way from a 360-degree view, and not be attached, you know, to this old thinking. I can't believe the hour has flown by. I mean, this has been, Dr. Tiff, you are awesome. I'm just so excited to meet you. I'm so encouraged by your work. We have just been cheering you on in Cleveland with everything that you do. We're so honored that you shared the 21-day challenge in your community. We love that, and we hope that you will stay with us with the challenge. More to come. And
Yes.
I think that there's something that you have to share with the network as well. And I look forward to being a champion, for that to be able to happen. So
Thank
I want to thank
you.
everybody who joined us, and I just can't wait for like part 2. I think we have more to talk about, so we have to get back together.
And I have to say, I'm a native Cincinnatian, so it's always great to connect with my Ohio sisters.
Okay. So we gotta get you back in the Ohio Council. Yeah. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. It's been absolutely wonderful to have you. And we will see you next week for our last week of Go Live for 2021. Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Thanks, Tiff.
Thank you.